Thank you all for joining us this morning, and we're going to get into a very exciting debate, which is what works, what doesn't work, and where should we go from here, because I think, Caitlin, you're a moderator for some of the panels to talk about how we're differentiating. So let me start with you, Caitlin. Do you want to just set us up for where are we with 10 DLC, where are we with toll-free, and then go from there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the words of the day today might be fragmentation. There's some fragmentation in the A2P messaging space in Canada today. There are 2 approved, sanctioned A2P routes in short code and toll-free, and we don't have a sanctioned or approved legitimate 10DLC route in Canada. So that obviously creates some issues. I think there's, from my perspective, I'm not the one on the ground trying to sell messaging to clients or to brands, but I think from my perspective, we see a bit of an issue with overall awareness and education of the status of A2P messaging in Canada. We quite often get inquiries from brands who have had delivery issues with their messaging, and we don't have anywhere that we can point them to. And so we've talked for years with the various industry stakeholders in this room and the Canadian operators about how we can move forward with 10DLC. And so I think there's going to be some interesting opinions on the stage today and later this morning as well.
Yep. Speaking of operator opinions, I'm looking at Ryan, and what do you think are the significant challenges we're facing in terms of adoption?
Adoption?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think we would need consensus on a solution to be able to have adoption, because I think fragmentation is an issue for sure. But to me, the biggest opportunity for us is to tackle trust. I mean, we mentioned earlier, I think by Dario, I mean, I think the reason that we need a registered solution for long code is twofold. One is consumers and businesses want to communicate that way. So we have to operate and find a solution to be able to allow them to do so. But they want to do so with trust. And I think that is not what we currently have today from a ubiquitous perspective. I think the reason that this is also, like we've shown during the pandemic, a huge growth in long code traffic. And I think that's because of consumer choice and business choice, but also because of ease of access. I certainly think there's an opportunity for toll-free to grow as well. I mean, and it comes down from an operator perspective to me, to the fact that these allow identity. And so short code allows identity at a campaign level, but telephone numbers and toll-free numbers provide identity at an organizational level, and I think at an individual level, and I think that is a good feature of long code messaging.
Paul, do you want to share something about verification? Because to me, before trust, you get into verifying who you are, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think Caitlin brought up, we do have a knowledge gap. We talk to a lot of customers who've been messaging in the US and just feel Canada operates the exact same way, and lo and behold, to find out that's not how it actually works, and are upset about 10DLC. And I agree with what Ryan's saying too, is we have a trust issue, and I think the way that I look at 10DLC and coming to a solution, a consensus, is there's pillars, right? The traffic needs to be registered, needs to be identified who the senders are. That's important for sure. But we also need to put a lot of thought into how we verify the traffic, make sure that it's compliant. We're collecting consent properly. We're maintaining those records properly. And then, for me, the last line of defense is message filtering, because we see so much, we call it drift as we go through those different pillars in what somebody says, who somebody says they are when they come in, what they say they're verifying, and then what they actually start sending over time. And so I think any solution has to keep those 3 things in mind, and it's not easy for sure.
I want to add one thing to that. Just listening through, what we haven't said yet is that the 10 DLC traffic's flowing across an intercarrier channel. So another challenge as you talk about trust is the anti-spam filtering. I'm just going to reinforce what Paul said, but we need to be able to separate what the policy is for a 10DLC campaign versus intercarrier messaging. They're very different, obviously. A blast campaign, one-to-many in a short period of time, you want to allow that through on an approved A2P channel. But on an intercarrier channel, obviously that's fraud. You do not want to let that through. So part of this, the trust aspect of it, the registration of it, will allow for different policy setting across the different channels, so that we can actually get the messages to the right subscriber at the right time.
Yeah, and I'd add, I think as we move forward and get more refinement on that algorithm, for lack of a better term, across both channels at the aggregator, at the carrier, and even the communication service provider level, I think the more we're able to refine the algorithm so we see less false positives, the actual enterprise trust grows, and then they're able to communicate with their consumers and users in a more effective way that instills trust sort of down the line. But I do think that we've seen some need, just as a community, as an ecosystem, to further refine that algorithm. I think it's sort of upon us to lift up those stories from our customers and end users that of those use cases that just aren't being accounted for across the industry. So I think that that's something that we can collectively do together as well.
That's a great point. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, first of all, I agree that anti-spam and fraud is a huge important, especially on the intercarrier connections. But from an operator perspective who's been trying to get visibility to that for about 2 years, it's not easy. So whether, and there's a plethora of solutions, both in network, in cloud, in partner, and yet, and I've said this before at a MEF event, I feel like I'm flying a little blind. So I mean, I think it's, whatever solution we find needs to provide an easy access for operator transparency, because we are there to really safeguard the consumer.
And so that brings me to my next question, which is more about equitable verification. Today, if I am a brand that wants to send messages in Canada and I say I want to do toll-free versus TNDLC, I've been hearing this a lot in the industry chatter. What are we recommending to the brands? What's the best way to move forward?
Well, in Canada today, the best way to move forward is either in short code or toll-free right now, because we don't have an A2P channel that provides reliability for brands, especially if you're sending at scale. And that's just a reality. So we're here in this room today. We're going to talk a lot about that today, and we're going to try and come to some solutions on how we might push that forward. But I don't think that there's any denying right now that 10DLC in Canada, from an A2P perspective, is a broken channel. It's, I think I think everybody in the room will agree. I think all the operators will agree that we should try to find we need a solution for 10DLC. I think it has to be the right-sized solution for the country, for the carriers. It has to be low cost, low touch to really drive value. But we have this conversation all the time. We have a lot of brands, and quite frankly, you need it because there are many use cases that don't translate well to a toll-free number or to a short code. But on a grand scale, that's what we tell, most of the conversations we have with customers is like, if you want reliability, you have to choose short code or toll-free in Canada. And then even between those two channels, there's differences. We've talked about this a lot. They operate differently, right? So short code has a very different onboarding process. The carriers are in control of who they're onboarding. As it relates to toll-free, it's a less friction onboarding process. We still collect all the information, but the carriers have entrusted a vendor like ZipWhip to do the verification. But in doing so, messages do get filtered, right? So there are the possibility of false positives. And so when we're talking to customers, it's just a matter of trying to educate them and say, like, this is where you're going to drive the most reliability, but understand that there's differences between these channels.
And we have a full panel on message filtering, because that itself is a complicated topic by itself. But the question then goes to verification. What are the challenges you'll see because 10DLC will push the current processes for verification? Do you see any challenges around verification? If 10DLC is broken, I'm going to kind of click down on that statement. Is it the verification part that's broken? Like we don't know who's sending what to whom?
So I look at it a couple of ways. I think we first need to validate the brand. You need verification at the front of the brand that's involved. Ideally, the next step is the campaign. And we just talked about drift. I won't go there. But what changes, or at least what we've seen across the past few years, is that a brand may register. A brand may have a good campaign, but then one of two things may happen. They may change the service without notifying anybody. It's not always a bad thing, but it's still drift, so we don't understand the change. Or somebody gets hacked, and fraud starts coming across their channel, and it opens up a different category. What's lacking, or ideally we identify, is how do you identify that drift? How can you do it in near real time so it's not when your customers are calling a day or two later and obviously something very bad has happened. I think it's that verification up front needs to be done, and then it's potentially periodic revalidation, and then it's the traffic itself needs to be vetted in, like I said, near real time to identify how does it align with that traffic that's flowing.
And I think the challenges are more acute. I don't know if you'd say the same, but the challenges tend to be more acute when you look at 10DLC because it's just so much closer to the user. Because we can't go out as consumers and get a toll-free number or a short code number, but all of us have a 10DLC number. And so it just tends to be much more conversational traffic. And so people are just used to that conversational nature of that channel. And so standing up a framework that actually is able to monitor that from a templated A2P perspective is, we've seen in the US, and I know we have another panel on this, but it's challenging.
From my perspective, we need to find a solution that has a balance of both flexibility and standardization, right? And I mean, as often is the case in Canada, we also have the benefit of not having to start from scratch. We can learn from our partners south of the border. There's lots to be learned in terms of both good and bad in terms of how we can approach it in Canada. And I think that we get the opportunity to be able to, I think, reduce the complexity. I mean, that would be what I'd try to avoid in the Canadian solution, whatever that is to try to make it a purpose-built for what we see are the problems in Canada, and yet provide us the flexibility to deliver the trust that we need.
Well, I think from a compliance perspective too, that's one of the other areas that we as an industry need to make sure that there are guardrails put around these 10DLC programs. In Canada, we have the short code compliance policies or the short code guidelines. ZipWhip has its toll-free policies. And so I think 10DLC just ends up being this de facto channel for disallowed content. And I think that's something too that with that solution, we need the enforcement policies to back that up as well. And we need to make sure that we have sound best practices, that aggregators are prepared to enforce those best practices and those compliance requirements as well.
That's a great point. And that brings me to my next question, which is around message monitoring and those kind of guardrails. Because part of the question, I guess, in everyone's in this room and for the brands that are not in this room and that are our customers is, when will it become accessible? The A2P channel, that is 10DLC, and how far we are. And I feel there are two aspects to it. Number one, of course, is verification, vetting of the brand, of the campaign, and everything else, but also the operational burden of monitoring traffic like that. So that's a question to this panel, and who wants to go first?
I'll jump in. A challenge that I think arises is context, and I use that word intentionally. As we talk about separating channels, we're really, for 10DLC, it's separating the intercarrier and the 10DLC path. Context becomes very important. What may look like spam to just a normal person may not be if you've opted into a campaign, that makes sense. If you're opting in, to a fitness trainer who then sends out a link that says to lose weight, click here. On one hand, that looks like fraud, but because of your opt-in, it's not. It's legitimate traffic, it just has the appearance of spam. So I think that is a large challenge as we look forward to monitoring and there will be false positives as you try to identify, map it back to an opt-in potentially that assumes the data is available in a central format, or as you're looking at spam, it's the customers or the enterprises moving channels SMS to MMS to RCS, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad. It's taking a look at all of the filtering and trying to pull the data together. Right now, they're very segmented. So what you see in SMS, you're not watching an MMS and vice versa. We need to look at how do you centralize all the data, not just the brand verification, not just the campaigns, but the data that you identify in spam as well across the ecosystem.
Yeah, so much there, for sure. I mean, it's, yeah. Like, what's the question again?
The question is about how far are we from the ideal state in terms of
Like,
the operational burden of message monitoring.
I'll just go, so toll-free's in that title, so I'll just talk a little bit about toll-free. When we developed a toll-free channel in Canada, the most important thing that we did was we worked with the carriers on it. And so we spoke to the carriers about how they wanted us to protect their network, how aggressive we needed to be in doing so. So we talk about context for sure. And it's philosophical as well, like how you approach message monitoring. And when we developed toll-free, it was, okay, well, we're going to generate false positives. Absolutely guaranteed we're going to generate false positives because our job in moderating this channel for the carriers is to protect them and their mobile subscribers before the message leaves our network. And so we take a very proactive approach, more than just a reactive approach or an analysis filtering approach to doing that, and it generates false positives. And that just is kind of contradictory to how you think about these things. You try and drive down false positives, and instead we think about it as, okay, well, we actually need to beef up the muscle to manage false positives because we're going to drive them. If we want to protect the carrier networks, we're going to drive false positives in doing so. And it becomes a strategy of how quickly can you resolve those. There's a balance, obviously, of course, that you have to strike, but it's when you're trying to develop that trust, both with brands and consumers in a channel, then you have to take a more aggressive approach to do that. And I will say, I think when we get to the point of having a 10-deal solution, I think we should, in Canada, expect to see a fair percentage, over 10%, probably less than 30%, of traffic that just won't be registered because it just won't pass compliance. And that's what lives there today. So it's a balancing act, but I think it's also a philosophical approach about how you work with carriers and how you do that transparently and how you share data.
And I don't think false positives are a problem. It's the remediation. We should be able to remediate false positives tightly and pretty quickly. Like it's as you said, it's really a factor of communication and data. And so I would focus on that. I mean, we're going to have, especially in the beginning as we're calibrating, I mean, ultimately, with any new program system, you're going to have to calibrate it. And we'll have to do that together as an industry.
Yeah, this is where I'm sort of the eternal optimist, where I think that time is our ally in this, because we will, as the data set grows, obviously get better as an industry. From a monitoring perspective, I also think that creating those checks and balances throughout the ecosystem is important. It can be challenging because obviously the KYC, the Know Your Customer, is layered. I said this earlier actually, and it's your customer's customer in some cases. And so traditionally, we've left it up to maybe your customer to know their customer and their customer. And I think the burden is growing on the actual service providers, aggregators, carriers, to create more of the awareness and knowledge for your customer and really create that burden of proof, I guess, for lack of a better term, to understand who is sending those messages and why. And from like a macro data perspective, we've been talking a lot about sort of the nuances of campaigns and the discreteness of a campaign. This is another conversation I was having with Dave from Somos earlier, and the concept of a brand score, right, is something that we don't necessarily factor in all the time into those algorithms in different places. And so that could also be something that would be interesting to introduce, that macro level data, the merchant kind of identification, merchant ID, brand score, whatever you want to call it, that actually filters through the ecosystem and that you can understand, like, hey, this company's traffic is really, really solid, and so maybe that is factoring into the actual score so that we're able to get better at creating a more holistic picture of the traffic and better able to monitor.
I want to pick up something you said. I do agree that time is our ally, I think is what you said, when it comes to how we calibrate. But I'm not sure it's our ally when it comes to getting started.
That's fair.
The window for this is, well, I would say passing. So we have a small window opportunity to be able to capitalize on the fact that SMS is still the #1 communications media for marketing and other use cases in Canada. I think fraud will overtake us, so lack of trust. I think over the top, eventually a killer app is going to come there that has the ubiquity of SMS, or at least close to it, where it makes it more cost effective for a CPL to be able to be cheaper than an SMS delivery. And so we need to figure out a solution, or at least try to figure out a solution, and soon.
I would take that one step further too. I would say that in the 10DLC channel itself in Canada, at least from the data that I have, that I can see, we're not seeing a lot of growth, right? So it's not a exponentially growing channel at the moment, and I believe that that's largely because we don't have an A2P solution for it. And I think that there's a timeline involved here as well as to how quickly we could pull something together here to capture those brands and pull those brands into the ecosystem, to use 10DLC before they just completely lose, trust or reliability or.
It's because the growth is on the intercarrier side. The growth is happening on the intercarrier side. That's the problem.
Yeah. But right now we'll just call it a flat channel, and we don't have a lot of time to turn that around. And
Speaking of time, and I do want to open up the floor for questions. Maybe a quick poll. How far are we from like a working 10DLC solution? 6 months, 12 months, 24 months? Notice I used months.
I mean, I would say closer to the 12-month mark. I don't think anything's happening in 2023.
it's at least 9 to 12 months, at least. And that's if we started running now.
6 would be tough, mainly because everything in this industry moves at its own pace to a certain extent. But I think 6 to 9 months is doable. I had a very promising meeting yesterday trying to figure out a way to test things. So I think that we need to move. So 6 to 9 months is my middle ground of these two.
He's just not considering that you need a cross-carrier solution for it too, right? So.
I don't debate that you need one, but at some point, you got to start someplace.
I agree.
Certainly, I want a cross-carrier solution.
Yeah, I actually lean, I'd say 6 to 12 months. And part of where I'm coming from is traffic's flowing today. So it's how can we, maybe it's a phased approach. I lean more towards 12 if we want a full solution. But if we're able to start phasing pieces in, identify the existing traffic, but to put different filters against it as you're working on the brand registration, you could start earlier. And so we phase our way in, so 6 to 12.
It doesn't feel unreasonable. From I lean heavily towards the go-to-market perspective. So I'm thinking about what are our developer implications for like creating the provisioning and registration mechanisms we need on our side as a communication service provider, and then also just the consumer education, which is always super fun. So I think that if we're able to get progress in the next 6 months, then seeing that as a reality in 12 months is possible.
And go ahead.
Just a question on that. Like the CSPs, for the most part, operate North America wide. So would there be a big lift on that side to be able to open Canada?
I guess not if it flows through the same process that we're seeing today in the
Or
US.
similar process.
Similar process, right? Sure.
But similar process.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good point. I think those CSPs that are doing this work today that have that muscle, verification in those pillars, I think that realistically it's a quicker lift, like an easier lift for them for sure. I'll speak for Canada. I think you also have to, it's not going to be I don't see anything being a lift and shift from exactly what we do in the US to Canada. Canada has their own compliance. There's some nuances and some differences that have to be.
The Queen agrees.
Thank you.
The King now, I'm so sorry.
On that note, Caitlin Long, do you want to summarize this and be our final word before we open up for questions?
Sure. I think that a lot of great points have been made today. I think that in general, when you look at the +1 dialing plan, the North American dialing plan, especially if you are a business that operates within, or even if you're a business that operates without, you expect more consistency than we're delivering today. I think that's sort of the ultimate path, even whether it be on channels or across countries. And so I think that we have some work to do there to create some consistency with the experience, both Canada, the US, as well as across the channels, expanding it to 10 DLC within Canada, for example, and then having that same consistent, reliable experience across the channels.
On that note, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. No questions yet?
We did that good.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, panel. It's been great, and I think we're set up the stage for the rest of the discussions that we're going to have, so we'll keep talking. Thank you.